Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it.
They think the problem of evil is a problem for Christians. It is not. It's a problem for the atheist. Explain to me how those things can be evil if there is no God.
He thinks that if there's a God, he's automatically grounded morality, that there is a factual basis for morality. So here's my advice to you, dear listener, if you're an atheist and you meet Greg Koukl or somebody like him who just assumes that Christians have an objective basis for morality. Ask them this question.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of the most annoying religious people. Up for today is one Greg Koukl? Cookie? I'm sorry, I'm butchering the name. It's like Koukl or something. It's not a name I'm familiar with, I'm afraid. But in any case, Greg is a Christian apologist and radio talk show host. And he's about to give a caller some advice on how to deal with atheists and how to evangelize effectively. I can't help but wonder if Greg's advice is questionable at best, but as per usual, dear listener, I'll allow you to be the judge. Let's dive right into Greg's comments.
Yeah, I had a question.
Okay.
So I've got 6 friends who are all atheists. They're all they're my closest friends. They're pretty militant atheists, and they have been for a few years. They think Christianity is dumb. They think it's not logical, and I think part of that's because of the colleges they went to and what they've been exposed to.
So thinking Christianity is dumb and not logical makes one a militant atheist.
They're pretty militant atheists, and they have been for a few years. They think Christianity is dumb. They think it's not logical.
Ah, gotcha. Christ above. I mean, the word militant is a very serious word to use. Clearly, this is a smear tactic, and this is a smear tactic that the Christian community, that the apologetics community has been using now for decades. When you describe somebody as militant, you're kidding yourself if you don't admit that that comes with a connotation of violence. It comes with a connotation of physical hostility. It's just an absolutely ridiculous statement. But you heard it here, dear listener. All you need to do is think that Christianity is dumb, or all you need to do is think that Christianity is illogical, and suddenly you're a militant atheist. I just want to draw attention to that right off the bat. I know Greg hasn't said this. He doesn't push back either, unfortunately. But this is a very common meme in the Christian community, and it's important that we call it out for the ridiculous claim that it is, wherever and whenever we find it. And with that acknowledged, let's move on with the caller's question.
I'm trying to see the best approach I can take to start witnessing to them and evangelizing to them. I'm newer to apologetics, and I love it.
Translation, I'm newer to bullshitting.
Got your books, Frank Turek's, Lee Strobel, J. Warner Wallace, pretty much all the big names, which are all awesome individuals, and I love their books so far. I'm just trying to determine what's the best approach.
Well,
should I wait until I have pretty much every single argument down really well? And should I do it one friend at a time, one-on-one? Like, I'm not sure where to start.
Okay, those are all great questions. First of all, I tip my hat to you. You have a bunch of atheist friends. You have what do they call it, a target-rich environment there, and so that's great.
A point of order, dear listener. Please notice what's happening here. And again, this is not the fault of the talk show host, but in some sense, what you fail to call out, you promote. what you fail to draw attention to, you're permitting, right? But this caller is admitting that he already believes in God, and only now he's reading texts which are going to help him to prove that that's the case.
I'm newer to apologetics, and I love it.
And only now he's reading texts that are going to help him to prove that to others.
Well,
Should I wait until I have pretty much every single argument down really well?
Please notice, dear listener, that this is a very obvious and gross example of confirmation bias. This is the problem with Christian apologetics, or apologetics of any religion. You start with your conclusion that God exists, and you go out into the world searching for evidence to fit that conclusion. This is the exact opposite of what rationality is. This is the exact opposite of what a reasonable person who cares about the truth should do. This is appalling. Please notice that this is the opposite to what scientists do when they use the scientific method. Scientists form a hypothesis, sure, but then they go about trying to disprove that hypothesis. They go through a process of falsification, and only if a hypothesis passes a rigorous procedure of falsification does that hypothesis graduate to become a theory, right? This is completely asshat backwards. This caller has called in with the conclusion that God exists, and only now they are looking at the evidence to try and find evidence that fits. That's what apologetics is at the end of the day. People get into apologetics in order to prove something that they already believe is true. And that, in my humble opinion, dear listener, is awful. It's unjustifiable. It's incredibly unreasonable. And people who engage in this kind of thinking, if you even could dare call it thinking, they're just irrational. They're fundamentally irrational. And Greg Koukl here doesn't call this out. And he's about to hop on the bandwagon here and give this guy some advice about how to proceed with this irrational endeavor. And anyway, I just wanted to address that before we get into Greg's comments here, because it's just a joke. But take it away, Greg. Give the caller your sage wisdom and advice. Oh, brother.
I hope that the way that you're comporting yourself and living your life, and I'm pretty confident of this, is going to be noble and commend Christianity to them, so you're not sending out any negative signals.
Yeah, I think this is a very important piece of advice. Whatever you do when you're converting people to Christianity, whatever you do, dear listener, don't send out any negative signals when you're informing your interlocutor that if they fail to adopt your point of view, they're going to burn in hell forever. Whatever you do when you're convincing your interlocutor of that fact and their eternal torment that awaits, whatever you do, don't send out any negative signals. Got it? Okay, just wanted to make sure we're on the same page.
And you're also doing a great job in boning up on the information. All the people you mentioned are great people to read.
I hesitate to call what's in those texts information, so this is a very equivocal use of that term. Information is a bit of a compliment, Greg. Bit of an overstatement, I would have thought. Propaganda is the word you were looking for there, I suspect. Information. One of the people he mentions is Frank the Liar Turek.
Got your books, Frank Turek.
Frank Turek is the most dishonest person on planet Earth.
Are you judging me?
He is unbelievably deceptive. All he does is misrepresent and deceive. And you want to call what's in Frank Turek's works information.
And you're also doing a great job in boning up on the information. All the people you mentioned are great people to read.
Oh my God. I want to get sick. This is ridiculous. And, furthermore, he's complimenting the caller here on reading up on this information. In other words, he's complimenting him for engaging in the endeavor that I've already pointed out. Confirmation bias. Well done on engaging in an absolutely obscene example of confirmation bias. Well done, brother. Keep up the good work. Oh my God. See, this is why these kind of apologetics communities are so dangerous, because they reinforce each other's bullshit. I think this is the most interjections I've ever had in a video before we actually got to the bloody point. I'm sorry, dear listener. Let's try and proceed a small bit. I apologize in advance if I have to interject a couple of seconds later, but look, if he says stupid shit, I've got to interject, don't I? I mean, what else are we doing here, right? Anyway, take it away, Greg. Take it away.
Well, what I'm going to be suggesting to you is a tactical approach, okay? And this is always the best way to start any conversation with people who are hostile in terms of their ideology. They may be very nice to you, but and as friends, but still their ideas are hostile, okay? And to your ideas, or they are hostile to your ideas.
An ideology is a set of beliefs. That's what Christianity is. Atheism is a single belief on a single issue. It is a single belief on a single issue. Does God exist? Atheists say, we're not convinced. End of story. There is no other atheist position. There's no such thing as atheist morality. There's no such thing as atheist politics. There's no such thing as atheism in any other domain. If you ask me what is the atheist view on veganism, for example, your question is arguably a category mistake. That makes no sense whatsoever. Atheism is a single belief on a single issue. So they can't even get the basics right when they're about to have a discussion about how best to deal with atheists.
This is always the best way to start any conversation with people who are hostile in terms of their ideology.
If you can't even define your interlocutor successfully, what hope is there here for Greg to actually give solid advice? All I can tell you is that it doesn't bode well, does it, dear listener? But again, let's hear what he has to say. Take it away, Greg. Take it away.
There's a tremendous amount of safety in questions. And this specific challenge, when atheists say that Christians are stupid or it's irrational, this is one that I've faced before. And there's a very simple question to ask at this point. And maybe you have asked it and they've responded. I'd like to hear what they had to say. But lots of people who are atheists think that the atheists are the smart guys. In fact, one famous atheist, Daniel Dennett, refers to atheists as the brights. You know, like the brights, the smart people, right? It's kind of self-serving, it seems to me, and the religious people are the dim bulbs, you know, kind of thing. All right.
Yet another misrepresentation. So there is now multiple signs here, dear listener, of dishonesty on Greg's part, or at the very least, multiple signs of him being completely misinformed. Remember, just because somebody got something wrong doesn't necessarily mean that they're being dishonest. But Greg strikes me as a smart guy, so he's either being dishonest here or he's not as smart as I thought he was. Because this is a misrepresentation of what Daniel Dennett says in his book. And I'm going to quote the actual passage to you, dear listener. I've done the work so that you don't have to. And I quote, "My essay, The Bright Stuff, in the New York Times, July 12th, 2003, drew attention to the efforts of some agnostics, atheists, and other adherents of naturalism to coin a new term for us non-believers, and the large positive response to that essay helped persuade me to write this book. There was also a negative response, largely objecting to the term that had been chosen, not by me, bright, which seemed to imply that others were dim or stupid. But the term, modelled on the highly successful hijacking of the ordinary word gay by homosexuals, does not have to have that implication. Those who are not gays are not necessarily glum. They're straight. Those who are not brights are not necessarily dim. They might like to choose a name for themselves, since, unlike us brights, they believe in the supernatural. Perhaps they would like to call themselves supers. It's a nice word with positive connotations, like gay and bright and straight. Some people would not willingly associate with somebody who was openly gay, and others would not willingly read a book by somebody who was openly bright. But there is a first time for everything. Try it. You can always back out later if it becomes too offensive." Now you tell me, dear listener, was Daniel Dennett implying there in his text, in his amazing book, Breaking the Spell, that those who are not bright are dim?
One famous atheist, Daniel Dennett, refers to atheists as the brights, you know, like the brights, the smart people, right? It's kind of self-serving, it seems to me, and the religious people are the dim bulbs, you know, kind of thing. All right.
Was he implying by labeling the atheist movement as brights that Christians and theists more generally are stupid? Absolutely not. He points out that the reason for selecting the word is because it has positive connotations. Brightness, light, beauty, positivity. It has positive connotations. It's exactly the same as the gay movement using the word gay, right? They took the word gay and co-opted it and used it for their movement. Now, does that mean that if you're not gay, which is to say if you're not a homosexual, that you're glum or not happy? Because, of course, the original meaning of the word gay was that you were contented or happy, right? Does it mean that if you're not gay, you're not happy, that you're sad, that you're glum? No, of course not. That would be a completely ridiculous interpretation of what's going on here. The gay movement adopted and co-opted that word because it has positive connotations. And that's what's going on with the word bright. Adopting the word bright as a relabeling of the atheist movement could potentially associate positive connotations with the movement. Positive connotations that are sorely needed when you consider the fact that atheists are distrusted in many countries around the world. The data on this is appalling. Atheist is a dirty word, specifically in the United States. So co-opting a new word and calling the movement of brights could in fact affect a positive change for the movement, just like the term gay helped the gay movement, right? It doesn't mean that your interlocutors are not intelligent. It doesn't mean that they're not smart. This is a misrepresentation by Greg Koukl, yet another misrepresentation. And he can't even get the basics right because Daniel Dennett didn't come up with the idea, as he points out in his own book. Somebody else came up with that idea. Daniel Dennett was merely inspired by that person. And so there's multiple errors here. There's so much wrong. So to just wrap a neat bow around this, was Daniel Dennett implying when he deployed the word bright for the atheist movement that non-atheists aren't smart, that they're not bright, that they're not intelligent? Absolutely not. He says in his very own words that it doesn't have to have that connotation, just like the word gay doesn't imply that straight people are not happy. The word bright does not imply that non-atheists or theists are not smart. And to suggest otherwise is to misrepresent Daniel Dennett's book. But you know what? I'm not surprised, because that's exactly what Christian apologists do. And I'm afraid Greg Koukl has demonstrated that he's no different. Maybe the misrepresentation is an honest mistake, in which case he's just not thorough in his research, or maybe it is intentional, in which case he is a liar. I'll let you make up your own mind, dear listener. But with that acknowledged, let's move on.
This is the question I would ask. What is dumb or irrational about Christianity? What is dumb or irrational about Christianity? And now you want specifics. You want them to say, you want them to spell it out.
Gee, I don't know. I've produced almost maybe 150, 160, something like that, videos on my channel over the past 3 years, explaining why Christianity, in some of its forms, not every form, why some of its ideas, not all of its ideas, are in fact spectacularly irrational and silly. Do you have time, Mr. Greg Koukl? Because you can go through my backlog. I mean, do I really need to answer that question now? Why it might be irrational to believe this thing? Why don't we start with the fact that there's no good evidence for it? Why don't we start there, Mr. Greg Koukl? There's no good evidence for it. What you have is a holy text which makes all sorts of claims. So the text itself doesn't constitute evidence. The text itself is the origin of the claims. So there's a whole bunch of claims. The question is, do you have any evidence for those claims? I've never once heard a compelling evidence-based argument for the existence of your God. Never once. And I've been searching. I've been doing this quite a while at this point in time, dear listener, as you well know. Show me the evidence. But please notice that there's something else going on here that's a little bit sinister, I would say. Maybe this is intentional, maybe it isn't. It's a ridiculous question to ask your atheist interlocutor to explain what's irrational about Christianity. It's bordering on a reversal of the burden of proof.
What is dumb or irrational about Christianity? And now you want specifics. You want them to say, you want them to spell it out.
It's not the job of your atheist friends to prove to you that your religion is irrational or stupid. That's not how this works, Greg Koukl. That's not how this goes. If I met a Christian in my social group and they said, well, show me what's irrational about Christianity, I wouldn't answer that question. I would say, oh, no. Hang on a minute here, buddy. Hang on a minute. I'm not about to go down this road of demonstrating to you what's irrational about your religion. The question is, what good reason do you have as the proponent of this faith? What good reason do you have that this religion is worth believing in? That it's got good epistemological justification? That you have an epistemic warrant to believe what you believe? What evidence do you have to believe that there is an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God that created the universe and that created us? What evidence is there to believe that there's an afterlife, or that prayers get answered, or that miracles have occurred, or that God sent his only begotten Son to earth? Sure, we have evidence that Jesus Christ existed. To my understanding, the majority of historians agree on that fact. New York exists, it doesn't mean Spider-Man is real. The fact that there is a historical Christ doesn't mean that he was the Son of God, and it doesn't mean that he performed miracles and that he came back from the dead. My question is, what evidence do you have, Greg? What evidence do you have, dear Christian, that your religion is true? Because you're not going to flip the script and reverse the burden of proof so easily on an informed atheist such as myself. It's not my job to demonstrate that your religion is irrational. It's your job to demonstrate that it's worthy of belief, that it meets an epistemological warrant, an epistemic warrant. That's on you. It's not my job to disprove your faith. And be very aware of this, dear listener, if ever you encounter a Christian. They come up with many subtle ways to reverse the burden of proof. And this is just another in a very long string of those attempts. This question is hogwash. And it doesn't surprise me at all that Greg Koukl's first line of defense for his religion is to try and flip the script, reverse the burden of proof, and get an atheist to try and falsify an unfalsifiable proposition, because at the end of the day, Christians believe in a God that is indistinguishable from nothingness, spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. How are you supposed to disprove that? And contrary to what some Christians might say, no, that's not a strength of your religion. If I cannot interact with your claim whatsoever, and it's impossible for me to disprove it, well, I've got news for you, buddy. It's also impossible for you to prove that it's true, in which case it's irrational to believe in it. That makes no sense at all. And this is why I don't take the hardline atheist point of view of saying that I know that there are no gods. My position is that I am merely unconvinced in the existence of gods until such time that Christians like Greg Koukl supply me with good evidence, supply me with an epistemic warrant to believe their claims. Until then, all you've got is a big list of claims, assertions, and reversals of the burden of proof. And to be quite honest, I'm not interested.
So if you were to say to your friends, Ross, what is dumb about, what is stupid, I guess is the word they use. Oh, they use the S word. Oh, naughty. What is stupid about Christianity? What do you think they'd say?
They'd probably just say, oh, look at all the evil in the world. Like God can't, or a man can't walk on water. Just kind of the typical slogan-y atheistic responses, basically.
Okay, let's just take one at a time. Okay, according to the Christian worldview, it's a magical world.
I thought it was an insult to describe their God as a magical sky god, but here Greg Koukl owns it. Bravo! Bravo, Greg. You're the first Christian apologist I've ever heard who's admitted to the fact that you believe in a magical worldview, that your thinking is magical in nature. Well, props to you, Greg. You've just flabbergasted me. I can't believe it. You're damn right you believe in a magical worldview. And you said that with a straight face. You said that with a straight face. Well, you heard it there, dear listener, straight from the horse's mouth. So some Christian apologists, it seems, bite the bullet. Christianity is the religion of magic. They do believe in magic. It's all about magical thinking. Props to you, Greg Koukl. I mean it. That is an impressive admission. Let's hear where he goes with it.
If God exists, if there is a God, wouldn't something like that be possible? Walking on water.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, of course it would be possible. Okay, so the real question is whether there's a God or not. Okay, so now what you've done is you've deflected, parried, that was the word I was looking for with the other caller, with the sword. You parry the condescension. Oh, people walk on water. Nobody can do that. Well, no, not in your world. But in God's world, yes, they could. Okay, now the question is, which world is the true world?
This is a really slimy response, and I think it's fallacious, dear listener. I actually disagree. Proving a God doesn't necessarily prove the walking on water claim. That doesn't necessarily follow. It would depend on what kind of God you prove the existence of. You could prove the existence of a deistic God, which is a God that got everything started and then pissed off. That wouldn't prove that Jesus walked on water. So it's not exactly true that if you prove God, therefore you get to just assume all of these other claims. You still have to do some work, especially if you believe in the kind of God that Christians believe in. It's not clear to me how a God that is described as spaceless, timeless, and immaterial could even interact with a physical world. How could a non-physical substance interact or enter a physical reality? That doesn't make any sense at all. You would still have to explain the mechanism. So this idea that proving God just guarantees the truth of these other outlandish claims like walking on water and all the rest of it, raising people from the dead or what have you, that doesn't necessarily follow. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. But again, you can see here the kind of slimy thinking that's at play. He's encouraging his caller here to deflect, or as he puts it, parry certain questions.
So now what you've done is you've deflected, parried.
So rather than answer the questions that honestly curious atheists might have, you're going to try and dodge those questions and reframe the debate. I don't think that's an honest way of having a conversation, personally speaking. I don't think that makes sense at all. The truth would be, actually, I can't prove that anybody walked on water. So let's talk about this other thing over here where I'm going to try and demonstrate the existence of a designer. But even if you proved the existence of a designer, you wouldn't have proved that somebody can walk on water. A doesn't necessarily guarantee B. I don't think there's a straight line there. You actually have to do some work because there's many possible gods you can prove. Not even all Christians believe in a God that's all powerful. There is a thing in Christian theology called process theology. And process theologians believe that God is not all powerful. And if God isn't all powerful and you prove the existence of that specific God, well, then maybe it's not possible for somebody to walk on water. Maybe it's not possible for somebody to raise people from the dead, and so forth. And again, looming behind all of this, we still have the interaction problem. Even if you prove the existence of a God that's immaterial, how would that God interact with the physical world and send his only begotten son such that he could walk on water, and so forth? I just want to raise this, dear listener. It's important to consider that proving God doesn't necessarily guarantee the truth of other premises. The Christian would still have to do some work to demonstrate that the God they've proven is the God that allowed an entity like Christ to walk on water. And so, yeah, with that acknowledged, let's move on.
Now, they also raise the issue about the question of evil. Okay? Now, I've just been working on this the last few days in this book I'm writing. So the question, now here's the question. They think the problem of evil is a problem for Christians. It is not. It's a problem for the atheist. And I'll see if I can show you this very quickly, because the question I'm going to ask is, when they say the problem of evil, so you believe there's real evil in the world? Yes, I do, obviously. They're going to say, okay. Now, the next question is really important. Are you saying that there's evil out there, that things people do are actually evil? Or are you just saying there are things that you don't like? Now, Ross, that's the difference between objective evil and or morality and subjective morality or relativism. Okay, you just want to get clear. All we're doing is getting clear on their idea. Do you mean think there are really real, actual evil things in the world? Okay, that's what I want to know. Now, when people raise the problem of evil, they actually usually mean there's evil in the world. Okay? Even the atheist says that. Look at those things. Look at the shootings. Look at this. Look at all the genocide. Look at all that stuff. Look at all that bad stuff. How could God allow all of that? Okay.
Right.
Okay, so fine. Let's say, okay, this is another move here at this point. Now that you've clarified that they believe in objective evil, those things are actually bad. Okay, fine. So you're an atheist, right? Let's just, yeah. So notice I'm role-playing here. I'm role-playing both sides for the sake of time.
Yep.
So you're an atheist. Yeah, right. So let's just say there is no God. Okay. Are those evil things still happening? All this stuff you just described, all these school shootings and the genocide and all these rapes and all that stuff, it still happens, right? Yeah. Okay. So there's no God, but all these evil things are happening. Explain to me how those things can be evil if there is no God. That's the question. Explain to me how those things can be evil in the way you're talking about them if there is no God. Now, they might say, wait, I don't get what you're after. Okay, wait a minute. You said these things are evil, right? Yeah. That means they broke a rule. They shouldn't have done what they did. There's some rule of goodness that they didn't abide by. They broke a law. That's what it means to be evil, right? Yes. Okay, so you're an atheist. Tell me where those laws come from. I'm trying to make sense of your worldview.
So Greg Koukl has made things very easy for himself here by, as he puts it, role-playing the atheist position. He has assumed that the atheist interlocutor in this hypothetical is a moral realist, the kind of person who believes that there is objective morality in the world. I'm not a moral realist and I'm an atheist, so this role play doesn't interface with my point of view at all. I don't believe there's such a thing as objective evil. I don't believe there's such a thing as objective goods and evils. That doesn't exist as far as I can tell. It's not possible to ground morality in a factual basis. I think the word evil is a label that we put on behaviors that we find objectionable. It's that simple. And yes, that means that there's no objective standard for right and wrong. But thankfully, we're a social species that has evolved to cooperate and get along. So even if there's not an objective basis, we get on most of the time without that objective basis because we require each other in order to survive. Reciprocity is essential for human thriving. If we don't help each other, if you don't scratch my back and I don't scratch yours, things don't happen. Our society doesn't thrive and we don't get along. So I'm not convinced we need an objective basis for morality to function. I don't think there is an objective basis for morality, and yet society still thrives for the most part. What Greg Koukl is doing here is assuming that his atheist interlocutor is a moral realist. And he's quite right. I don't think an atheist who's a moral realist can ground their morality. I don't think it's possible to ground objective moral rules and duties in something factual. You can't do that without committing one fallacy or another. Some of my viewers here, who will no doubt be utilitarians, will say, but isn't it grounded in pain and pleasure? Pain and pleasure are facts. The question is, how do you get from those facts to what one ought or ought not do? And if you just make that leap without explaining how you got from A to B, you will be engaged in something known as the naturalistic fallacy, where you've jumped from is to ought. The question is, how do we get from the facts of pain and pleasure to the so-called factual recommendations for behavior? If you're a moral realist, remember, you think that what you ought do and what you ought not do are facts. I'm not convinced you can get from is to ought. I've never seen a convincing or a compelling argument that explains how you get from is to ought. I've never seen a compelling argument for the existence of objective morals and objective duties. I've never seen a convincing argument from that. If you want to try in the comments below, dear listener, be my guest. But I'm an anti-realist. As far as I can tell, good and evil are merely labels that we put on behaviors that we either approve of or disapprove of. So I think Greg Koukl is quite right here when he says that an atheist cannot ground their morality in something factual. But the problem is, nor can the Christian. Please notice the big fat assumption in Greg Koukl's worldview here.
Explain to me how those things can be evil if there is no God.
He thinks that if there's a God, he's automatically grounded morality, that there is a factual basis for morality. So here's my advice to you, dear listener, if you're an atheist and you meet Greg Koukl or somebody like him who just assumes that Christians have an objective basis for morality. Ask them this question: what makes something factually right or wrong from a Christian point of view? And what they'll tell you is that God makes something factually right and wrong. In other words, they're divine command theorists. But divine command theory is not an objective basis for morality. Here's the question, an additional question for any Christian who thinks that it is. Name for me one thing that is objectively wrong according to divine command theory. Just one thing that is objectively wrong in divine command theory. They won't be able to name something. Because the truth is, if God were to command the opposite, then that would become a fact. If we take something that we would all agree on, murdering an innocent person, that's clearly wrong. Even in my subjective moral framework, I think that's wrong. The difference between my worldview and Greg Koukl's worldview is that even though I'm a subjective moral thinker, even though I'm a moral anti-realist, I think murdering innocent people is wrong in every single case. I acknowledge that that's just my opinion, but I think murdering an innocent person is wrong in every single case. Please notice, however, that if God commands a Christian to murder an innocent person, well, then it would no longer be a murder. It would just be killing an innocent person, because murder defined is the wrongful killing of someone. But if God commands you to kill a person, that automatically becomes an objective moral duty. You ought do it, because the whole point of divine command theory is that what God commands becomes intrinsically moral by fiat. Might makes right. So, in other words, Greg Koukl's moral framework permits any and all behaviors. All God need do is command them. And boy, does God command them in the Bible. There are many examples in the Bible of complete and utter atrocities. I've made a video recently about the flood. I would love to know Greg Koukl's thoughts on that. Was it objectively moral for God to wipe out the inhabitants of the entire planet with a flood? Was it moral for God to drown everyone? Was it moral for God to kill the earth's every living inhabitant, including innocent babies? Well, if Greg is a divine command theorist, which it sounds like he is, he's duty-bound to accept that that was a moral act, even the innocent babies. And on that note, by the way, when I put up that video a number of weeks ago, several weeks ago, however long ago it was, the response that I got from certain cohorts of the Christian community would make your skin crawl. Just like Greg Koukl here, these people were divine command theorists, and they said, yeah, it was moral because God did it. It was morally permissible, and it was morally righteous for God to drown innocent babies, because that's the whole point of divine command theory. Whatever God does becomes intrinsically moral. So don't you sit there on your high horse, Greg Koukl, and think that you've got the key to the door that is a moral, objective worldview. That is not the case. You don't have the key to that door. Your moral realism is revealed to be the ridiculous thing it is as soon as you get asked one question. Name for me one thing that is objectively immoral according to your Christian worldview. And you won't be able to name one, because all God need do is command the opposite, and then that becomes objectively moral. And so you don't have a basis for morality either, Greg Koukl. You simply don't. If anything, your worldview permits atrocities. My worldview, and I'm acknowledging that it's subjective, my view of morality, my meta-ethical framework is that of a moral anti-realist. I don't think there's any objective morality, but despite the fact that I don't think there's any objective morality, I would never in a million years preside over, promote, or condone the drowning of innocent babies. Now, some Christians might respond and say, how do you know they were innocent, Magic Skeptic? Because they were babies! Are you kidding me? And then they do this ridiculous move. Oh, well, you don't know the future, Magic Skeptic. God might have foreseen that all of those babies were going to become terrible people. Oh, really? And an all-powerful God could think of nothing other than to drown them. That was the best answer. Nothing other than to drown them. God couldn't have re-educated them, no? God couldn't have used his might and his wisdom and his power to re-educate those babies, no? Couldn't have made it so that they were going to grow up and be decent babies. No, we have to drown them. What kind of a lily-livered, pathetic, weak, insane God do you believe in? What kind of a moral framework is that? So your question, Greg Koukl, is nonsense. Trying to put the atheist on trial here for their moral framework, if they are a moral realist. And remember, he's taken the easier side of this debate to suit himself in this phone call. The truth is, if the atheist is a moral anti-realist, he's going to have serious problems dealing with me, isn't he? But he's assumed that the atheist in question is a moral realist in order to declare some kind of moral high ground here. But it's hogwash. The truth is, Greg Koukl, you and atheists, anybody who's a moral realist is in the exact same position. It's not possible to ground your morality in something factual. It's not possible to do that without committing one fallacy or another fallacy, whether it be the naturalistic fallacy on the atheist side, or whether it be something as simple as the Euthyphro dilemma on your side. Tell me, Greg Koukl, the things that God commands, are they good because God commands them, or are they good because of some external standard? If they're good because God commands them, you have the problem that I've just outlined, where morality becomes arbitrary, and God could command anything to be moral, including murder, which he does in the Bible wholesale, and people like you defend it. But if it's the latter, if indeed what God commands is moral because of some external standard, well then God is not the arbiter of morality, in which case your whole point of view falls apart anyway. So don't you sit there smugly and pretend that your moral framework is superior even to a moral realist who happens to be an atheist. You're in the exact same boat, Greg, the exact same boat. And in my humble opinion, my position is more defensible than either party in this hypothetical. A moral realist, whether they be a theist or an atheist, is in a pretty precarious situation when it comes to grounding their allegedly factual moral framework. I'm not convinced you can do it. And so, with all that said, I'm going to move on.
Ross, what I'm doing here, now I'm shifting the burden from the Christian worldview. Because in our worldview, we can make sense of evil. It's a broken world.
And you just heard it from the horse's mouth. You're shifting the burden of proof. So rather than have a conversation about whether or not your God is real, Greg Koukl here recommends his fellow Christian to shift the burden of proof and get the atheist who happens to be a moral realist sweating and struggling to demonstrate why objective morality exists on their worldview. Let's go down this road and assume that the atheist can't do it. Let's assume that your atheist interlocutor fails to demonstrate that morality is objective in their worldview. Let's imagine the atheist can't do it, folks. Does that mean that your God is real? Does that mean that your religion wins the day? Does that mean you verified that God exists? Absolutely not. This is completely dishonest from the ground up. This is a slimy apologetics tactic. Try to get the atheist to demonstrate whether they can prove that objective moral values and duties exist. And so therefore, you don't have to worry about proving that your God is real. You heard it here, dear listener. This is the most appalling advice. This is Apologetics 101. Obfuscate and reverse the burden of proof. Misrepresent and engage in assertions. And then declare victory at the end after you've demonstrated that the atheist who happens to be a moral realist cannot verify the existence of objective moral values and duties. That is the advice that you're getting here from Greg Koukl. And it's utterly despicable, Greg. You should be ashamed of yourself. This is appalling. At what point were you planning on getting to the evidence for your God? At what point do you actually plan on dealing with the atheist's concern about whether or not there's evidence for your God? Oh boy, Greg, would I love to have a conversation with you in real life. This is utterly appalling and it's unacceptable. And you would not get away with it if you were dealing with an atheist like myself. You will not reverse the burden of proof. You will not change the topic, and you will not get me sweating trying to prove something which is quite frankly irrelevant. Because even if the moral realist who's an atheist fails to demonstrate the existence of moral values and duties on their atheism, even if they can't do that, that says nothing about whether or not your God exists and whether or not you can ground objective moral values and duties in your worldview, which, as I've already pointed out, I'm not convinced you can. This is just disgraceful.
Ross, what I'm doing here, now I'm shifting the burden from the Christian worldview. Because in our worldview, we can make sense of evil. It's a broken world. Evil is when people disobey God. Now, why he allows that, that's a question that can be answered. That's a separate issue.
And yet that's still God's responsibility. So what he's appealing to here is Adam and Eve. And this is just ridiculous. This is just ridiculous. So Adam and Eve screw up in the Garden of Eden. Let's just assume it's true. Fair enough. Adam and Eve screwed up. And then God banishes us to a broken world, a fallen world. So humanity now has to endure earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, diseases, and all sorts of misery. Whose fault is that? You want to blame Adam and Eve? Doesn't the punisher adjudicate over what the punishment ought be? Isn't the specifics of the punishment down to the punisher? How is it our fault that we live in a world with evil? Yeah, sure, you can blame Adam and Eve for disobeying God, for biting into the forbidden fruit. You can blame them for that, although there is a wrinkle on that which I'll get to in a moment. But let's just assume you can. Adam and Eve had true libertarian free will, and they used that libertarian free will to disobey God. And so God banishes them to a fallen world. Isn't the kind of world that God banishes Adam and Eve to God's responsibility? Couldn't he have banished them to any possible world? After all, this God is all-powerful. So if God banished us to a world with horrendous diseases, tsunamis, earthquakes, and all the rest of it, then that is God's responsibility. So there is a problem of evil. You believe in a God who has selected a Cirque du Soleil level of brutality for us to endure. That is God's responsibility. You don't get to pawn that off on Adam and Eve, even if they had libertarian free will, because they broke the rules, fine, but God adjudicates over what specific punishment exists. By way of analogy, this is like me chopping off the fingers if I had a child who misbehaved, and then I chop their fingers off and say, well, look, it's not my responsibility that your fingers were removed. You misbehaved. But that would be appalling, because I adjudicate over the punishment. I decide what punishment the child receives. And clearly, if I decide as the punisher to remove the child's fingers, I'm a moral monster. It would be appalling if somebody were to suggest that, oh, but look, it's the child's fault. They were told not to misbehave and they broke the rules. So they've earned the finger removal that they've had to endure. No, they haven't. The torturer and the punisher is responsible for the punishment that they adjudicate over and implement. And God, if there is one, adjudicates over an appalling punishment. We have been banished to a world which is frankly just not good enough. It's just not good enough on a theistic worldview. And it is God's responsibility. You cannot blame this on us. But getting back to that wrinkle that I wanted to address, it's not even obvious to me that it is Adam and Eve's fault, because God put them in the Garden of Eden, having foreknowledge of the future, knowing that they would eat from the forbidden tree, the tree of knowledge, or whatever you want to call it, knowing that they would eat the forbidden fruit. God puts the tree in the garden, knowing it will tempt them, knowing that they will succumb to that temptation. He puts the snake in the garden, knowing that the snake will tempt them. God has foreknowledge of everything that's about to happen, and he puts all the pieces in place despite that knowledge. And you want to tell me that it's Adam and Eve's fault when they were set up to fail? And then on top of that, you want to blame humanity for the evil that exists in the world? This is just too much to bear. Your theology is appalling. And the fact that you defend it like this, Greg Koukl, the fact that you think Adam and Eve are a good justification for evil that exists in the world, demonstrates the lack of depth in your thinking. I'm sorry, and I'm not engaging in an ad hominem here. I'm not suggesting that he's an idiot, therefore he's wrong. I'm suggesting the exact opposite. I'm saying he's so wrong here that I have to conclude that he lacks depth of thought and that he might actually be an idiot. I'm sorry, dear listener, but it has to be said. Let's move on.
Let's just say you're right, there is no God. But those things still happen, right? And they're still evil, right? Okay, so tell me, where are you getting your standard that judges those things as evil? Where does that come from? Now, there's the problem they're going to face is there is no answer. I know what many of them will say. Many of them are going to say, well, we evolved these ideas. But when they tell me they evolved the ideas, I have another question, because I know they just made a mistake. This is what labored painfully to make clear in the book, and hopefully when it comes out next year, it'll be clear to people who read it. The question is, then I'm going to say, well, wait a minute. I thought you said there's evil out there in the world. Those things are actually evil. Yes. How can evolution make some act evil in itself? That's the question.
It can't. And this is exactly why I'm not a moral realist. Evolution is not a foundation for objective morality. It is, however, a foundation for subjective morality. It is true to say that we have evolved as a social species. And the evolution of a social species would include proclivities for reciprocity and cooperation and getting along. The evolution of a social species would naturally produce things like we shouldn't kill each other, we shouldn't steal, and so on and so forth. It's very easy to understand how evolution can produce these impulses, but these impulses are not objectively grounded. Again, I'm a moral anti-realist. Greg Koukl has chosen to focus this entire call, this entire hypothetical, on an atheist who's a moral realist, because it makes it easy for him to show the failings in moral realism. Please notice, however, dear listener, that at no point has he shown the failings of atheism. What he's done is reframe the conversation by his own admission.
So now what you've done is you've deflected, parried. Ross, what I'm doing here, now I'm shifting the burden from the Christian worldview.
He has reframed the conversation as a discussion about moral realism. And what he's done is reveal that atheists or naturalists cannot ground objective moral values and duties. And we're agreed on that, Greg Koukl. But that's not a weakness of atheism. That's a weakness of moral realism. And that weakness applies to you as well. Divine command theory does not solve the problem of grounding objective moral values and duties, as I've already explained. So this entire phone call, this entire conversation that he's had here is completely dishonest from the ground up. He has reframed the entire conversation such that he hasn't provided not one shred of evidence for his God. Instead, what he's done is encourage his caller to reframe the debate and get atheists to try and demonstrate the existence of objective moral values and duties. And if they can't do that, which they can't, I don't think it's possible because I'm a moral anti-realist, when the atheist inevitably fails at that task, he's going to declare victory and say, see, there you go, atheism is hogwash. But that doesn't invalidate atheism. All you're doing is invalidating moral realism. Atheism still stands. You still haven't demonstrated the existence of your God. By showing that the atheist can't ground objective moral values and duties as a moral realist, you haven't demonstrated the existence of your God, and you haven't demonstrated that your theistic framework can ground objective moral values and duties. All you're doing here is assuming that your worldview is superior simply because the atheist can't do an impossibility. This is an appalling way of having a conversation. But again, dear listener, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. This is what apologists do.
See, all evolution can do is make me believe they're evil, but that's all it is. It's just my belief so that I can get my genes into the next generation or something like that. But biology can't make anything bad. It can only make us believe things are bad for some evolutionary purpose. So it turns out that all evolution can do is a relativistic morality, and internal morality. It can't make the outside things bad. These are the kinds of questions that I'm going to press my atheist friends on, who, when I ask them what's stupid about Christianity, what's irrational about believing in God, and they say things like that, I say, okay, you help me to understand how you make sense of the evil you're complaining about, given your atheistic materialism. It fits in my world.
Right.
How does it fit in your world?
And there you have it, dear listener, an arguable masterclass in deflection and reversing the burden of proof. At the end there, the only comment he offers in favor of his position is an assertion. My worldview can make sense of this, yours can't, therefore I win.
It fits in my world.
Were you ever going to demonstrate any of this, Greg Koukl? Do you ever have a conversation where you attempt to justify this stuff? Or do you just always reverse the burden of proof, make the atheist moral realist sweat, and then declare victory by default? Because that's what you've done in this phone call, and that's what you've recommended your listener to do in the world. Well, I hope your listener never encounters me, because these apologetics are going to fall flat on their face, and deservedly so. This is a cavalcade of bullshit, nonsense, and deception. What you're encouraging your listeners to do is to reverse the burden of proof, reframe things, and make assertions. It's garbage. Your worldview doesn't win simply because a moral realist can't justify their moral realism on an atheistic worldview. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Your worldview doesn't win by default, Greg Koukl. You still have to go about demonstrating that your worldview is correct. You still have to demonstrate that you can ground objective moral values and duties in your worldview. And I don't think you can do that. You can't demonstrate that objective moral values and duties exist because divine command theory is hogwash, and you cannot demonstrate the existence of your God, which is precisely why when atheists question you, you default to reversing the burden of proof and reframing the debate by your very own admission. It's just despicable. And I'm going to leave it there, dear listener. Did you enjoy my response to Greg Koukl? If so, drop a like on the video, guys. It helps out the channel enormously and it costs you nothing. If you've been watching my content more recently and you've yet to subscribe, smash that subscribe button while you're at it, guys. I upload weekly. It will be great to have you on board. If you want to take your support of the channel a step further, jump into the description box below. When you get there, you'll find the link to my Patreon page. If you click that, it'll bring you to my Patreon page and you'll be able to sign up for as little as £3 per month. And for that, depending on which tier you choose, you will gain access to a plethora of perks, bonuses, and extras. And with all that said and out of the way, thank you very much for watching this episode, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.